Born under a prophecy that marked her as unable to bear a wolf's heirs, she grew up carrying a fate she never chose. Years later, her mate shattered what remained of her heart when he rejected her before the pack and called her barren. With nowhere left to go, she disappeared before dawn and found herself in the territory of the feared Alpha King. But after a single night changed everything, the Alpha King stood before her former mate and smiled. "She's carrying my heirs." The look on her mate's face was unforgettable. What nobody knew was that the prophecy surrounding her birth had never been fully told. Barren. The word did not echo. It did not need to. It dropped into the great hall of the Vesper Pack like a stone into still water, and every single wolf in that room felt the ripple. Lucia Morty stood beneath the silver moon crest carved into the stone above the altar, and she could not breathe. Her ivory ceremonial gown caught the torchlight. Her dark hair was pinned with moonflower blossoms that her mother had braided in herself that morning, humming softly, hands warm, telling Lucia she was going to be the most beautiful Luna this pack had ever seen. That had been 4 hours ago. That had been a different life. Now Marco Rossi stood 3 feet away from her and would not look her in the eye. She had loved this man. She needed the room to understand that. She had loved him the way you love the first warm day after a brutal winter. She had given him 7 years. 7 years of standing beside him at every council meeting, of smoothing over his temper with the elders, of pressing her hands against wounds he got in border fights and praying over him in the dark while he slept. 7 years of building something she believed in. And he said barren like it was nothing, like it was weather. The pack physician stepped back from the altar, the ritual bowl still smoking from whatever they had burned inside it, and he would not look at her either. Nobody would. That was how Lucia knew something was wrong beyond the word itself. Not a single pair of eyes in that hall was holding hers with any real surprise. The pity was already there, preloaded, waiting. Her knees hit the stone floor before she even felt them go. The cold rushed up through the thin fabric of her gown, and she pressed one hand flat against the ground just to feel something solid, something real, because the room was tilting and the torchlight was blurring, and somewhere in the blur she could see Bianca already moving. Bianca, who had sat in the 3rd row with her hands folded perfectly in her lap. Bianca, who had smiled at Lucia with her teeth every time Marco turned away. She watched Bianca step up toward the altar like she had rehearsed it. Maybe she had. The mate bond that had lived in Lucia's chest for 7 years, that warm thread she had followed through every hard season, snapped. It did not fade. It did not soften. It broke clean and violent, and the pain was so sharp and so sudden that Lucia tasted blood where she had bitten down on the inside of her cheek. Her whole body lurched forward and she caught herself on both palms, breathing through her teeth, staring at the stone floor while the hall murmured around her. Marco finally spoke again. His voice was calm. That was the part that would haunt her. Not cruelty, not guilt, just calm like he was reading from a list. He said she was released from her bond. He said the pack could not be built on an empty foundation. He said it was nothing personal. He said it like he believed that. He said it like 7 years was an empty foundation. 2 pack enforcers appeared at her sides. They lifted her by the arms. She did not fight them because her body had stopped accepting instructions from her brain. She was somewhere behind her own eyes watching this happen to a woman who looked exactly like her. They walked her down the center of the hall, and every face she passed was someone she knew, the elder who used to ask her for tea, the young she-wolf she had mentored through her first shift, the mother of the boy Lucia had helped name, all of them still. All of them watching. They pushed her through the back doors and into the night. The cold hit her like a wall. The forest behind the Vesper grounds was black and endless, and the snow was already ankle-deep, soaking through her thin ceremonial shoes in seconds. The doors closed behind her. She heard the bolt slide home. She stood there in the dark and the silence and the freezing air with moonflowers still pinned in her hair, and she thought, absurdly, that her mother was going to be devastated about the gown. She walked because stopping felt like dying. The trees swallowed her. The snow got deeper. She had no coat, no boots, nothing but the gown and the cold and the thin sound of her own breath coming faster and less steady with every step. She did not know how long she walked. Time stopped meaning anything. The forest looked the same in every direction, and the moon was high and pale and completely indifferent to what was happening to her below it. She fell near the ravine. She heard the water before she saw it, that low black rush of a river moving fast under a skin of ice at the edges, and then her foot caught on a root buried under the snow and she went down hard. She did not get back up. The ground was cold enough that it almost felt warm against her cheek after a few seconds, and that was when she knew she was in real trouble, because she had heard that was what happened right before the end. Things started to feel comfortable. She closed her eyes. She heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, not an animal, something heavier, something that was not afraid of anything in these woods. A shadow fell over her, and she forced her eyes open. The man crouching in front of her was not someone she recognized, but something in her blood recognized him. Dark coat, dark eyes, a stillness about him that the forest itself seemed to lean into. He looked at her the way no one in that hall had looked at her tonight. Directly, like she was someone worth seeing. He reached out and lifted her chin with 2 fingers, cold leather against her frozen jaw, and he studied her face for a long moment without speaking. Then he said it, quiet and certain, like a man reading a fact from a page he had already memorized. "You are not barren, they lied to you." Lucia stared at him. The terrifying part was not the words. The terrifying part was his eyes, because he did not look surprised to find her here. He did not look like a man who had stumbled onto a stranger in the dark. He looked like a man who had been waiting. And whatever he saw when he looked at her made something move behind those dark eyes. Not pity, not possession. Recognition. She woke up warm. That was the first thing that confused her. The last thing she remembered was cold, the kind that gets inside your bones and starts making decisions for you. The kind that whispers that lying down is fine, that closing your eyes is fine, that nothing matters enough to keep fighting for it. She had believed that whisper. She had let her eyes close. But she was warm. The ceiling above her was high and dark, carved stone with iron fixtures holding candles that had been burning long enough to drip, long streaks of hardened wax running down like frozen rivers. The bed beneath her was the softest thing she had ever been horizontal on in her life. Thick blankets pressed around her like someone had tucked her in deliberately, carefully, the way you tuck in someone you are not ready to lose. She lay there for a moment just breathing, cataloging what was real. The candles. The ceiling. The faint smell of pine resin and something older, something that reminded her of old books left in a room that never got enough sun. She sat up too fast and the room tilted. A woman appeared from a doorway Lucia had not noticed, moving quietly, carrying a tray with both hands. She was older, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by any of it. She set the tray on the table beside the bed without being asked, without fanfare. Like this was simply the next thing that needed doing. Lucia looked at the tray. Broth, bread, a small cup of something dark and steaming. She looked at the woman and said, "Where am I?" The woman said, "The obsidian keep." Then she poured the dark drink into a smaller cup and held it out and said, "Drink this first. It will help with the cold that got into your blood." Lucia drank it because she was too exhausted to argue. It tasted like bark and honey and something sharp underneath that made her eyes water. But within a minute, the last of the deep cold in her chest began to loosen, like a fist slowly unclenching, and she could breathe all the way down for the first time since they had pushed her out into the snow. She ate. She did not want to feel grateful, but her body was grateful regardless, soaking up the warmth of the broth like a dry field takes in rain. She ate all of it. The woman took the tray without comment and left, and Lucia sat alone in the massive room and looked at the stone walls and the iron candle fixtures and the single tall window across from her, where the sky outside was the purple gray of very early morning. The door opened, and Alessandro Valenti walked in. He looked different in the light of a room than he had in the dark of the forest. Larger somehow, though it was not about height. It was the way he occupied space, like the room rearranged its own priorities around him without being asked. He wore a dark shirt with the collar open, no ceremony to him, and he moved to the chair beside the far wall and sat in it the way men sit when they have nowhere else to be. He looked at her, she looked at him. She said, "You told me they lied." She said she wanted to know what that meant, and she wanted to know right now. He did not look away. He said she deserved to know all of it, and that was why he was here. He told her about the Stellara bloodline. He told it plainly, without drama, like he was handing her something breakable and trusted her to hold it. He said there were women born with an ancient celestial power woven into their blood, rare enough that most packs had stopped believing they were real. He said these women had one defining characteristic that the old texts described over and over in different languages across different centuries. Their bodies would not carry a child for any man who was unworthy of the power they carried. Not could not, would not, by design. A protection so deep it looked, to anyone who did not know what they were seeing, like barrenness. Lucia sat very still. He said her body had not failed her. Her body had been protecting her, rejecting Marco the way a flame rejects water, not because something was wrong with the fire, but because water was simply wrong for it. She felt something crack open in the center of her chest, not painfully, the way a seed cracks open, that particular violence that is also a beginning. She said, "How do you know this?" She said, "How do you know what I am?" He crossed to a bookshelf along the far wall, one of several she now noticed, all of them filled with volumes that looked centuries old. He pulled one out and brought it to her, open to a page near the middle. The writing was old, the ink faded to brown, but the illustration beside it stopped her cold. A woman standing under a full moon, light pouring out of her chest and hands, wolves on their knees around her in every direction. He said his ancestors had kept records for generations. He said the texts described a pattern. Every few centuries a Stellara would rise, and when she was fully herself, fully in her own power, she would stabilize something in the supernatural order that had begun to break down. He said the texts also described, in specific terms, what would happen before she arrived. A public rejection, a false diagnosis, a lunar eclipse the same night she was cast out. He looked at her steadily. He said there had been a lunar eclipse last night. Lucia looked at the page in her hands and then back at him, and she said, "So you came looking for me?" He said yes, but then he paused and said something she did not expect. He said he had come expecting to find a woman with power. He had not expected to find a woman who had survived that night on nothing but sheer refusal to lie down. He said those were two different things, and the second one mattered more to him than the first. She did not know what to do with that, so she looked back down at the book. The days that followed were not easy. She wanted them to be. She wanted the relief of being believed and the warmth of a bed and the absence of Marco to simply fix something inside her. But grief does not care about your new circumstances. She would wake in the night with the sound of that hall in her ears. The murmuring, the torches, the slide of a bolt on the other side of a closed door. She would lie there in the dark of the obsidian keep with its high carved ceilings, and press her hand flat against her sternum, where the broken mate bond had left something that felt like a bruise you could not see. Alessandro did not push her. That surprised her most of all. She had expected a man who had waited generations for something to want it immediately. Instead, he gave her space and time with a patience that felt almost unnatural. He had books brought to her room. He had the older woman, whose name turned out to be Sira, bring her meals without ceremony. He would appear in the corridor sometimes when she was walking and fall into step beside her without speaking, and somehow the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had both learned the hard way that words get used up fast and mean very little without weight behind them. Training began on the 5th day. It was not what she expected. She had imagined something physical, some kind of combat or endurance, the kind of thing packs used to toughen their members. Alessandro took her outside to the courtyard at dawn, frost still white on the stones, and he told her to stand still and breathe. Just breathe. He told her to stop thinking about what she was supposed to be and stop thinking about what she had been told she was, and just breathe and notice what was underneath both of those things. She stood there feeling slightly ridiculous, but she breathed. And on the third day of just standing and breathing in that frost-covered courtyard, she felt it for the first time. Something deep inside her chest that was not grief and was not hunger and was not the echo of a broken bond. Something that had been waiting there, quiet and patient, for a very long time. It felt like a coal that had never gone entirely dark no matter how much cold got poured over it. She opened her eyes and looked at her own hands. Alessandro was watching her from across the courtyard with his arms folded, and an expression she was beginning to learn. Not quite a smile, something more restrained than that, something that looked like a man carefully keeping a very large feeling in check. She said, "I feel something." She did not know how else to describe it. He said he knew. He said the first time it comes, it always feels small. He said, do not be fooled by that. She was not prepared for what happened 2 weeks later. It was a night session, her idea. She had started preferring the dark because the cold clarity of it helped her focus. She was standing in the courtyard under a full moon, working on the breathing, on reaching down toward that cold warmth at her center and drawing it up intentionally the way Alessandro had been teaching her, when something shifted. Not gradually, all at once. The warmth rushed up through her chest and out through her hands, and the light that poured from her was not candlelight and it was not moonlight. It was something older than both. It lit the entire courtyard. It hit the stone walls and bounced back. She could feel it reaching outward, and she could feel it touching the edges of everything alive within its radius, and she felt every wolf in the keep drop to one knee without being told to. She heard Alessandro's voice behind her. He said her name the way you say the name of something sacred, quietly, like you are aware it could hear you. Then she heard the sound of him kneeling on the stone. The light faded slowly, and she stood there shaking, not from cold, from the enormity of having held something that big inside her ordinary hands. She turned around. He was still there, one knee on the frost-covered stone, looking up at her with those dark eyes, and what was in them now was not strategy or patience or the long, careful calculation of a man who had been waiting centuries for a tool to arrive. It was awe. He said it quietly. He said that was what Marco was afraid of. He said the former alpha of the Vesper pack had known exactly what she was and had made certain she would never find out. Lucia looked at her own hands again, still trembling, still faintly warm. She thought about 7 years. She thought about the way Marco had said the word Baron without flinching. She thought about Bianca sliding toward the throne like she had practiced. She thought about a bolt sliding home on the other side of a door. And for the first time since that night, she did not feel broken by those memories. She felt something else entirely. The summit of the Silver Peaks was held once every 5 years, and every alpha who wanted to keep their standing had to show their face there. It was the kind of gathering where alliances were made and broken over dinner, where power got measured in who stood where and who bowed first, and who walked into the main hall without waiting to be announced. Lucia had attended twice before as Marco's Luna. She remembered standing slightly behind him both times, the way he preferred, quiet and decorative and careful not to outshine anything he considered his. She was not behind anyone this time. She walked into that hall beside Alessandro Valenti, and she felt the room change the moment she crossed the threshold. Not gradually, all at once. Conversations dropped, heads turned. She was wearing deep charcoal, no ceremony gown, nothing soft or bridal or designed to make her look like she belonged to someone. Her dark hair was down and she wore nothing in it, no flowers, no pins, nothing from that other life. She looked like herself, just herself. And somehow that was the most arresting thing in the room. She felt the stares, and she let them look. Alessandro walked beside her with his hand at the small of her back, and the touch was light but deliberate, the way you place your hand on something you are not afraid of losing because you already know it is exactly where it belongs. He had not told her what to expect today. He had said only that she would know what to do when the moment came, and she had almost argued with him about that, but something in the weeks since the courtyard had changed the way she trusted herself. Marginally. Enough. They were not seated 10 minutes before she heard his voice. Marco Rossi had not changed. That was the thing about men like him. The world could shift entirely on its axis, and they would still walk into a room like they had personally arranged the furniture. He was across the hall when she first spotted him, laughing with two other alphas, his hand on the shoulder of one of them in that way he had, that particular performance of ease that was never actually ease, just the costume of it. He had not seen her yet. Then he did. She watched the laugh drain out of his face. He crossed the hall in long strides, not running. He would never run, but moving with the barely controlled urgency of a man who has spotted something he thought he had already dealt with. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her the way you look at something that was supposed to stay gone. He said her name like an accusation. He looked between her and Alessandro, and something ugly moved behind his eyes. He said she had no standing here. He said this was a gathering of alphas and their bonded partners, and she was neither. He said it loudly enough that the people nearest to them went quiet, and that quiet spread outward the way it always does when everyone senses that something real is about to happen. He said she was a disgraced outcast who had been cast out for cause, and that whatever she thought she was doing here, she needed to understand that no one in this room had any reason to take her seriously. He looked at Alessandro when he said the last part, like Alessandro was the one he actually needed to address, like Lucia was a topic under discussion rather than a person standing right in front of him. That was his mistake. Alessandro did not respond immediately. He had a way of letting silence do the work that lesser men tried to fill with noise. He looked at Marco for a long moment, and then he moved his hand from the small of Lucia's back to her stomach. The gesture was quiet. It was not theatrical. He did not announce it or frame it. He simply rested his hand there, open and still, and looked at Marco without any expression that could be called hostile. The hall understood before Marco did. She watched it move through the room in a wave, the intake of breath, the widening eyes, the sudden sharp quality of attention that a space gets when something historic is unfolding inside it. The Alpha King of the Obsidian Throne, a man whose bloodline had held the balance of the supernatural world for centuries, standing with his hand on a woman's stomach while every pack leader in the territory watched. Marco looked down at Alessandro's hand. He looked back up. For the first time in the 7 years Lucia had known him, Marco Rossi did not know what to say. Alessandro said it plainly. He said she was carrying the next lineage of kings. He said the woman Marco had called barren, the woman Marco had cast into a snowstorm to die, was a Stellara, and that her children would hold more authority than every alpha bloodline in this room combined. He said it the way you state a fact that has always been true and simply waited for the right moment to be acknowledged. Marco's face went through several things in quick succession: disbelief, calculation, then something that was trying to look like contempt but was actually fear wearing a mask. He said it was impossible. He said she had been tested. He said the ritual had confirmed it and the pack physician had certified it, and none of what Alessandro was claiming could be real. Lucia took one step forward. She did not look at Alessandro. She did not look at the room. She looked at Marco, only at Marco, and she felt the warmth rise in her chest the way she had practiced, the way she had learned to reach for it, that deep cold glow that had always been there waiting for her to stop being afraid of it. She did not rush it. She breathed. She felt it move up through her ribcage and into her shoulders and down into her hands, and she let it come. The light that came out of her was not subtle. It filled the hall from floor to ceiling, and it was warm and white and older than anything in that room by several centuries, and every wolf it touched felt it in their blood like a tuning fork struck against the truest part of them. One by one, without discussion, without being asked, the alphas in that hall lowered to their knees. Not to Alessandro, not to some command, to something in Lucia's light that their bodies recognized before their minds could argue with it. Something that said this is authority, real authority. The kind that does not need your permission to exist. Marco did not kneel. For about 5 seconds, Marco did not kneel. Then his legs went down anyway, and the sound of them hitting the stone floor was the loudest thing Lucia had ever heard in her life. She held the light steady. She kept her breathing even, and she looked at the man who had said the word Baron in front of everyone she had ever known, who had cast her into the cold in a ceremony gown with moonflowers still in her hair, who had replaced her before her blood was even dry on the altar stone, and she made herself feel every single thing she had earned the right to feel. The grief, the rage, the long months of believing what he had told her about herself. She felt all of it, and she did not look away from him. Then the light faded. The hall was very quiet. An old man pushed through the crowd from somewhere near the back. Lucia recognized him. Enzo Rossi, Marco's father, the former alpha of the Vesper pack. He was pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cold, and his hands were shaking at his sides. He stopped in the middle of the cleared space, and he looked at Lucia, and she watched him try to find some version of this moment where he came out intact. He could not find it. He said he had known. He said it low and cracked, the way a man speaks when the weight of something finally gets too heavy to keep holding. He said he had known what she was from the beginning. He said Stellara's children would have outranked every alpha bloodline alive, and that he could not allow that. He said he had arranged for the pack physician to manipulate the ritual. He said he had made the Baron diagnosis happen. He said he was sorry. Lucia looked at him for a long moment. She said she heard him. She did not say she forgave him because forgiveness was not the point. The point was that his confession was now on the air in front of every pack leader in the territory, and every one of them had heard it, and the truth had a way of making walls fall down whether the people inside were ready or not. Marco was still on his knees on the stone floor. He was looking at her the way you look at something that used to be yours and is now so far beyond your reach that ownership feels like a word from a different language. She looked at him, and she felt something she had not expected. Not triumph, not the way she had imagined triumph would feel when she had lain awake in the obsidian keep in those first terrible nights imagining this moment. What she felt was quieter than triumph. What she felt was free. She turned away from him. She walked back to where Alessandro was standing, and he looked at her with those dark eyes that had found her half frozen by a ravine and had seen something in her that she had not yet seen in herself. And what was in them now was the same thing it had been in the courtyard the night the light first came. Not strategy, not satisfaction, just that quiet, enormous thing he kept carefully contained behind a steady expression. She stood beside him, not behind him, beside him. And Marco Rossi, former alpha of the Vesper pack, watched from the cold stone floor as Lucia Morty stood in a hall full of the most powerful wolves in the territory and took up exactly as much space as she wanted, for the first time in her life, without apologizing to anyone for any of it.